Many thanks to Dr. Radcliffe and the fine staff at Pinnell Center of Black Church Studies. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his 1967 speech entitled The Other America, spoke about three ghettos, three slums where the African American finds himself or herself: the ghetto of race, the ghetto of poverty, and the ghetto of human misery. I've been asked to expound on this ghetto of human misery. Because of the historic fall of man, all persons live with some degree or some threshold of human misery. To use the Apostle Paul's language, we all have a thorn of human misery to negotiate. However, for the African American living in America, he or she is waiting to exhale because the African American living in America has been given a larger thorn of human misery to contend with. And while this human misery might be rightly attributed to many factors, I will focus primarily on the African American struggle to secure and hang on to economic dignity. That is, I will argue that the underemployment and joblessness contributes mightily to African Americans' human misery. Before continuing, however, let me say this as an aside. Black people represent 13% of the U.S. population, 61.2% of which are middle class. In other words, according to a Brookings report dated February 27th, 2020, and entitled "The Black Middle Class Needs Political Attention Too," the Black middle class is growing. So we should celebrate this achievement. Progress has indeed been made. But according to Michael Strand's book, The American Dream is Not Dead, Blacks as a group are noticeably less upwardly mobile than white Americans. This is troubling, and that is another source of human misery. And that's another topic for another time. I want to address what's right in front of us. Dr. King said in his 1967 speech that the unemployment rate, for Blacks was twice that of whites, hovering around 8.4%. But if he counted the discouraged persons, those who had exited from the unemployment pipeline, the unemployment rate was more like 16%. Today, according to the Economic Policy Institute, African American workers had the highest unemployment rate nationally at 6.3% in the first quarter of 2020, before the pandemic raged out of control. This 6.3% rate for African Americans was followed by Hispanic workers at 4.8%, white workers at 3.1%, and Asian workers at 2.9%. Again, because many African Americans were likely discouraged, many likely dropped out of the game. So that unemployment rate is likely higher, perhaps around 12 or 13%. I find this shocking, considering, again, African Americans make up a mere 13% of the United States population. And I also find it remarkable, considering we live in the great America, the land of plenty, the land of abundance, the land of the free, the land of opportunity. I submit that human misery continues for many able-bodied African Americans because it seems like we are perpetually in a position of pulling up the rear. And because less encumbered access to a flourishing economy exists for some and not for all. My colleague, Dr. Amy Sherman, defines a flourishing economy this way. A flourishing economy is one that respects the freedom and dignity of all, that offers all opportunities for the deployment and exchange of their talents, and that is safeguarded by the rule of law so that fair play reigns and all people have the opportunity to become self-supporting. A flourishing and just economy is one that frees people to do good, What I am suggesting is that the human misery that many African Americans experience in this country of the free and the brave is related to their limited access to opportunities to become self-supporting. The opportunity to exercise their human agency by fruitfully employing their natural gifts in the economy. These limited opportunities are what I argue is the basis in part for the human misery that many African Americans still experience in the 21st century. As Imago Dei bearers, image bearers of God, we were created to worship God through our work. There's dignity in work because we are introduced to our God in Genesis 1 and 2, not as a king, not as a redeemer, not as a savior. Of course, God continues to serve in these roles. However, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we are introduced to God as a worker. God works, we work. Work gives our life purpose. Work is a cure for boredom and idleness. Work is a cure for sadness. My wife lost her job in February of 2020. Sadness filled our home. My wife was not sad because she made an idol of her work. She was sad because she could not contribute. She was placed on the sideline of life. Because so many African Americans are deprived of deploying their God-given gifts, imaginations, and abilities in the marketplace, many suffer from what Arthur Brooks, former president of the American Enterprise Institute, calls a dignity deficit. Imagine being equipped to do something, but not permitted or blocked to do it. This reminds me of Viola Davis' 2015 Emmy speech. She said this: "In my mind, I see a line. Over that line, I see green fields and lovely flowers and beautiful white women with their arms stretched out to me over that line. But I can't seem to get there no how. I can't seem to get over that line." Davis was quoting, of course, Harriet Tubman, who said this in the 1800s. Now check that, the 1800s. Davis went on to say, and let me tell you something, the only thing that separates women of color from anyone else is opportunity. You cannot win an Emmy for roles that are simply not there. I remember as a teenager not being picked to play pickup games of basketball and football. I had the ability and the desire to play, but I was not picked. That was hurtful of not being chosen to play, to belong. So imagine being equipped with skills and abilities, but not being chosen or picked to cross over the economic color line to opportunities to earn a paycheck. Imagine the psychological pain of not being able to get over this line and to grace the threshold of a company to work, to belong to a community. Imagine how cruel this is to someone who knows how to work and wants to work, but cannot get over that line. This having the ability to work and the desire to work, but limited opportunities, exacerbates this human misery for African Americans. Human misery is compounded because many of these unemployed or underemployed African Americans are parents who must accept help from outside the home. So imagine the humiliation that many parents experience when they cannot buy their kids Christmas gifts, but they must accept gifts from strangers outside the home. Their kids grow up thinking help does not come from within the family unit. Rather, they grow up thinking help comes from outside the home. Yes, as Brian Fickert writes in his book, When Helping Hurts, our good intention helping can actually wound and distorts one's view of work, or it could distort their work view. Human misery for the African American is magnified by this truth. Today, across every socioeconomic level, Blacks have significantly less wealth than whites. Over a third of Black families have either negative wealth or no assets at all. according to my colleague and sister Mersa in her book, The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap. Why should this wealth gap matter to us? Again, Mersa, my colleague and sister, says this: it is the wealth gap where historical injustice breeds present-day suffering. It is the wealth gap where historical injustice breeds present-day human misery for many Blacks. Think of wealth, money, security, and real estate as analogous to the level of water in a bathtub, while income is analogous to the flow of water into the tub, writes John Pender and others of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. So if we stick with this metaphor, that of a bathtub, many African Americans have a rather low level of water in their bathtubs, little income coming in, and a large drain where money flows out. Or think of it this way: many African Americans have no water line in their bathtubs at all. Pope Francis wrote this in his book, The Joy of the Gospel. Until exclusion and inequality in society and between peoples is reversed, it would be impossible to eliminate violence. The poor and the poor peoples are accused of violence, yet without equal opportunities. The different forms of aggression and conflict will find fertile terrain for growth and eventually explode. When a society, whether local, national, or global, is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringes, no political programs or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. Exclusion from the economy has driven many to heap more misery upon themselves. As Michael Strand puts it in his book, The American Dream is Not Dead, men without work are often men up to no good. My colleague and friend Travis, who pastors in West Virginia, can attest to that because he knows of young men who cannot find work and have resorted to opioids. I hope you're connecting the dots. If we can get people out of the unemployment, underemployment spend cycles and help them to find good paying jobs, crime and violence can actually decrease. So how do we relieve our African American brothers and sisters of this human misery so that they can exhale? Let me suggest 5 things. Number 1, ask why. At the beginning of the 20th century, historian W.E.B. Du Bois acknowledged that African Americans have made progress. That's undeniable. And he also said this progress was unequal, incomplete, and accompanied by wide gaps and temporary retreats. So instead of our default, which is to assume, we need to ask why. Why is this progress unequal, incomplete, and still accompanied by wide gaps? Why does it seem like we are perpetually in this position of pulling up the rear? We need to ask, why does this large wealth gap still exist between whites and Blacks? We need to ask why we're still having this conversation about human misery of African Americans in 2021. Some 54 years, if I did my calculations right, some 54 years later since Dr. King coined that phrase in the first place. We're still having this conversation about human misery, and we need to ask why. We need to ask, why is the unemployment rate so high for Blacks as compared to whites before COVID and will likely be after COVID? Once we answer the why question, then we can move to the next step of seeking a comprehensive remedy. Number 2, see others rightly. As my colleague Karen Pryor Swallow writes in her book On Reading Well, justice begins with seeing people rightly. How do you see your fellow Americans? How do you see your fellow African American brothers and sisters? We must first see all people, especially African Americans, as not ontologically inferior, or as a threat or as a pet. Rather, we must see them as a human being made in God's image, endowed with skills and abilities and dreams and desires. And because every African American is made in God's image, every African American deserves to be treated with royal dignity and respect. And because they are made in God's image, they have something to contribute. To work is a way to contribute. Number 3, practice the principle of mutuality. In Jeremiah 29:7, God tells his outcast people to settle down in that pagan city of Babylon, to build houses, to have babies, to plant gardens. He also tells them in Jeremiah 29:7 to pray for the city because, as Jeremiah writes, when the city thrives, you will thrive. Flourishing requires mutuality. Dr. King put it this way: we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Maybe that's why Nancy Pelosi recently said, one country, one destiny. We flourish when all people flourish, especially those on the back row of society. We must understand that our flourishing depends on the flourishing of others, and the flourishing of others depends on our flourishing. Number 4, cultivate the twin virtues of love for God and love for neighbor. Loving our neighbor begins with coming close and listening to our neighbor. Listening comes before responding. Practice Renee Watson's mantra. Great poets listen to their world and then respond back. We must listen to our neighbor and listen to our world, and then after listening, respond back. God wants us to cultivate a hearty and genuine love for our neighbor, much like the Good Samaritan. This love is not static or indifferent. Rather, according to Austin Chaney Brown in her book, I'm Still Here, she writes, this love refuses to see systems and structures of injustice. Brown adds, this love is troubled by injustice. We love our neighbor by caring for our neighbor. It is true that money doesn't buy happiness, but money in the bank helps lift some of the psychological pressures of poverty, of human misery. Let's work together to relieve folks of this psychological pressure, of this poverty, of human misery. And finally, number 5, be a champion of justice. The astute Bible reader knows that love and justice are related. Love and justice are the same, for justice is love distributed, writes one writer. We must embody justice. Justice is a core gospel principle. Doing justice is not like an option on a multiple choice test. Doing justice matters to God. If doing justice matters to God, it should matter to us, those that image him. Justice is righting wrongs and rendering what is due to a person. Justice demands action. You see, we are implicated to act justly once we see, learn, and hear of injustice. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, is more forceful. He writes this: we're all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. And the absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, and a nation. We must not only be citizens who see, learn, and hear, but as Christian citizens, we must actively seek justice on behalf of those who cannot. We must seek ways to give all persons access to earn a living. Those bent toward justice realize that to become a just society, a society must bring into community all its weak and defenseless ones, its marginal ones, giving them voice and a fair share in the goods of the community. In his book, Cities of Tomorrow, Noah Tolley writes, justice means addressing structures of discrimination and oppression, and creating conditions in which all may flourish. God equips and God calls the church for the sake of human flourishing. That is exactly why the church is not the church if it does not stand for justice. A church not active in pursuing justice undermines its own identity. Likewise, a Christian who is not active in pursuing justice undermines his own identity as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Sure, we've made progress since Dr. King's speech in 1967. That's undeniable. We have elected the first Black president. We have elected the first Black female vice president. However, we must continue working for the invisible rank and file. However, we must continue working for the invisible rank and file. We must continue working until we have restored all African Americans' economic dignity. You see, we belong to each other. We are all Black and white, polka dot, yellow children of God our Father. So let's labor side by side to get folks of all colors to work, especially our African American brothers and sisters, and thereby relieving our African American brothers and sisters of their larger thorn of human misery, so that they might truly exhale. Thank you.